Good evening and welcome to another season of The Proof is Out There. We are back. Tonight, we're focusing a whole episode on one of the most compelling mysteries in history, Bigfoot. We'll be investigating some of the freshest, most compelling evidence Bigfoot hunters say they've ever seen. The question, is the creature real? Is it a legend simply stuck in our cultural consciousness? Or is it just the world's longest running hoax? The big problem with Bigfoot is that much of the alleged proof turns out to be faked, like this video from 2013.
One of the complications of undertaking an investigation of a topic that's this controversial is that it seems to attract hoaxers like moths to a flame.
It really irritates me because it diminishes those of us who take this very seriously.
And yet, serious Bigfoot researchers seem to be growing in number. A recent article on the cover of the Wall Street Journal reported that real scientists are devoting real effort to the study of and search for Bigfoot, aka Sasquatch, even if most are doing it secretly to avoid reputational harm.
I think that this generation of scientists are open-minded to the prospect of other relic hominoids living alongside our own species.
How can that be? Well, many experts are re-examining the evidence of previous hoaxes and finding flaws in the arguments of the doubters. Take the ongoing debate between believers and skeptics over Ray Wallace, the man who was involved with the event that first made Bigfoot famous. Bluff Creek, California, 1958. Hundreds of massive footprints are found in the soil by men constructing a road into a remote area of Northern California. A headline in a local paper gets national pickup, and the name Bigfoot is born. The contractor on the project was Ray Wallace, and when he died, his kids told the press that their dad was Bigfoot all along, and had used these carved wooden stompers to leave prints all over the Pacific Northwest. Case closed? Not according to believers.
The carved wooden feet alleged to be the source of those footprints simply do not match the footprint record that has been collected and studied from that region.
In fact, compare the print on the right, which Meldrum believes is a real Bigfoot print, to the known hoax on the left. Meldrum points to the identical oval-shaped toes of the fake that are not reflected in the other footprints. And while the hoaxer's credibility has been deteriorating, belief in the earliest reports of Bigfoot has been gaining strength. We're talking about the folklore of Native American tribes.
Native Americans have had the longest relationship with the creature we now call Bigfoot.
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman points to the images like this, the so-called hairy man pictographs, thought to have been created by the Californian Tule River tribe around the year 500 AD.
They say this is a depiction of a Sasquatch that they just happen to call hairy man in their particular language.
The male is literally 8.5 feet tall, and his arms are spread 6 feet wide.
Note this interesting detail. There are other animals depicted in this cave.
Centipede, deer, beaver, coyote, you name it, they're all real animals. So why would this one example show something that is fanciful and mythological when everything else there is basically a drawing of things that are still found there?
Now I want to show you something, possibly the most confounding artifact we have ever seen. This is a photo of a ceremonial mask of the Tsimshian people of British Columbia, Canada. It was collected around 1914. Take a close look at the skull, the nose, and the teeth. This sure looks like a primate of some kind. Just one problem. There are no known primates indigenous to North America.
This mask was such an accurate and naturalistic depiction of what could only be a great ape. The very prominent eyebrows with very sunken eye sockets, the nose with nostrils that are laterally directed, a broad nose. But really significant is this distance between the nose and the upper lip. So what would have been the inspiration if some form of great ape didn't exist in North America?
If this mask, believed to have been carved in the middle of the 19th century, really is a depiction of a real creature, we still have to explain how that creature got to North America. One current theory is that Bigfoot originated from some common Asian ancestor, possibly Gigantopithecus. Over the millennia, that species could have branched into other legendary hominids, like the Yeti of Asia or the Yowie of Australia, while the subspecies we call Bigfoot might have migrated to North America via the Bering Land Bridge.
The most likely scenario is that a population of giant terrestrial bipedal apes that had dispersed through southern and eastern Asia had expanded its range into North America.
But if that's true, where are the Sasquatch skeletons? We find bones of fossils of other things like dinosaurs. Why not Bigfoot? Dr. Meldrum says that fact doesn't discount Bigfoot's existence.
It seems like there's fossils everywhere, but when you consider the periods of time and the number of organisms through that period, it's a remarkably small fraction that ever are fossilized and discovered by paleontologists. We continually find fossils of species that we had no idea existed. The absence of evidence doesn't mean the evidence of absence.
As we've said, there are no Bigfoot fossils, but there are alleged Bigfoot footprints. So let's take a closer look at a particular collection of prints that has gained notoriety amongst the Bigfoot community, which is no small feat. This story begins all the way back in 1991 in the Blue Mountains of Washington State, just north of Mill Creek. Former U.S. Forest Patrolman and Bigfoot investigator Paul Freeman has come here with a colleague looking for evidence of Bigfoot.
Sure enough, what they found were hundreds of tracks of a Sasquatch.
Freeman measures the prints and makes these plaster casts. He's convinced this area is a Bigfoot hotspot, and over the years, the evidence just keeps piling up. 1992, in the neighboring Deduct Spring area of the Blue Mountains, Freeman shoots this video showing what he claims is a Bigfoot ambling through the woods. The creature allegedly left more prints, like this. And 4 years later, even more prints found in the moist ground in the nearby 5 Points area. Look closer. These whoppers are 14 inches long. If they're real, whatever left them is big, really big.
Many of these footprints penetrate into the ground quite deeply. And this photograph right here, you can see right there, the mid-tarsal pressure ridge.
Check it out. According to Barrickman, this mid-tarsal pressure ridge is one of the key differences between human and Sasquatch anatomy.
Behind the metatarsals is a big jumble of bone right beneath the ankle. But that jumble of bones in human beings, it doesn't bend at all because we have an arch that holds our foot stiff. But Sasquatches can actually bend their foot to some degree at that location. It is called the mid-tarsal joint.
Of course, some have claimed this was all one big hoax perpetrated by Freeman, but Barrickman says we know what faked prints look like. You can see when we compare Freeman's to a known fake made with a wooden prosthetic. It sure looks like there's a difference.
Upon push-off, sometimes a mound of dirt is raised up behind the metatarsals. This was not possible with a fake wooden prosthetic.
The idea of the mid-tarsal break was actually developed by our very own Bigfoot expert, Jeff Meldrum. Meldrum's hypothesis has been, no pun intended, a major step in the investigative research of Sasquatches. Let's see what our experts have to say about these particular prints. Anthropologist Kathy Strain explains there's always been some skepticism when it comes to the findings of Paul Freeman.
A lot of people said he found so much evidence. He was outside all the time and he found prints here and he found prints there. And he has that well-known video that there's just no way that he could be authentic.
We know Professor Meldrum believes in Bigfoot, but he's also on the lookout for any potential hoaxes. That's why Meldrum decided to drop in unexpectedly on Freeman to verify his evidence firsthand.
I was a bit incredulous, but I thought, what have I got to lose?
Then he saw the latest 5 Points tracks up close. Meldrum quickly concluded they couldn't be prints from some local animal.
And the most likely candidate out there is the bear. The bear isn't completely flat-footed. Its heel does not entirely rest on the ground. The heel of a bear has a very pointed in appearance as opposed to the very rounded, full heel pad of the Sasquatch foot.
But the real aha moment was, you guessed it, evidence of that same mid-tarsal ridge ruling out prints made by any human foot.
The heel is elevated, this retaining that midfoot flexibility, the advantage of a very flexible grasping foot for climbing up into trees. Another one that jumped out is this track from Mill Creek in 1991, separated by a considerable number of years, and yet showing this exact proportions, the orientation.
Now, to quote Lewis Carroll, it gets even curiouser. Since all of these prints show evidence of the mid-tarsal ridge and are the same size, Meldrum and Cliff Barrickman not only believe that these prints are real, but that they could be coming from the same individual specimen of Bigfoot.
This particular animal's footprints have been found on a number of occasions. In 1991, 1992, 96.
There were remarkable similarities that suggested these could in fact be the same individual.
And get this, based on research, Meldrum thinks Sasquatches can live to be about 30 to 50 years old. So this specimen could very well be at least 15 to 25 years of age.
This evidence demonstrates the existence of an unrecognized species.
Our verdict? Potential primate print. We're sure these prints don't come from a bear. They sure look different from known fakes. And that mid-tarsal ridge appears to eliminate the human foot too. If they're real, they could be valuable evidence in proving Bigfoot's existence. It's been said that Bigfoot exhibits nocturnal behavior, perhaps to hunt or to avoid detection. But the cloak of darkness couldn't hide the creature in the stunning footage you're about to see, captured by two campers armed with a night vision camera. It's May 2012 near the town of Quincy, Florida. Retired Army Ranger Stacy Brown Sr., now deceased, and his filmmaker son Stacy Brown Jr. are camping in Torrey State Park on a search for the elusive Bigfoot. They start hearing some noises, so they pull out their FLIR thermal camera and head off down a trail.
We would hear something running on our right, and then we would hear something running on our left, and it stopped real quick. And then Dad looked up at up there at the tree, and he's like, "Oh, I see something."
The thermal camera is rolling as Stacy Sr. notices a little black object sticking out of one side of a tree.
Then it takes off and crosses this gap, and he goes into full-blown panic mode. The camera goes dead. He's like, we gotta go. He's like, do you got your gun?
Back at their truck, Stacy Jr. gets a first peek at this eye-popping footage, and this money shot that looks just like the iconic look-back frame of Patty from the famous Patterson-Gimlin film, which claimed to capture Bigfoot strolling alongside a Northern California creek in 1967.
I knew exactly what we had on camera. It was proof to me and my dad, because who on a Tuesday night is a mile and a half into the woods running around with no flashlight?
Noted Bigfoot investigator Steve Cole says he's not surprised by the area where this footage was captured.
In Florida, they have something called the skunk ape, and there's been a lot of sightings over many years of what they describe as a Bigfoot type of creature. What they call that is the skunk ape, partly because it smells skunky. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing as a Bigfoot. It's not quite as big or robust as the ones in, say, the Pacific Northwest, but that is kind of expected due to the climate being a lot more tropical.
These swamp sightings go back to the native tribes. The Seminoles and the Muskogee called the creature Esti Japjoki, or Tall Man, and claimed he was the protector of the forest. So could this be what the Browns encountered? We turn to our experts for answers. We first ask the most obvious question. Could this just be a person?
It was shot with a thermal imager, and so it's picking up the heat signature. Typically, if any clothing is being worn, it masks the intensity of the heat emanating from those covered parts of the body. Honestly, don't see any of that. It's just a pretty uniform signature that would suggest a body a la naturelle.
But why would a person be walking around nude in the woods? Wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka instead notes the way the figure moves seems more like a different animal that doesn't wear clothes.
It looks to be like a large primate, but it doesn't seem to match the body structure of the living apes, of chimpanzees or gorillas being the most prominent ones. It seems like its legs are too long, and when gorillas walk on their hind legs, they're not hunched over like that, they're more upright.
Some have theorized that gorillas or large chimps could have escaped from one of the private zoos that have littered Florida over decades. But anthropologist Kathy Strain says neither this creature's morphology nor its gait support that theory.
The way it comes out of the trees is what we call a Groucho walk. It's very typical of what witnesses say Bigfoot walks like. You can see it on the Patterson-Gimlin film. You can see it in other examples where it's this strangely bent knee gait. It seems to be out of human proportions in the sense that you can't see a neck. It has very beefy looking arms. It has interesting legs that seem shorter than what you would see in humans.
Whatever this was pretty big, in excess of 6.5, 7 feet in height perhaps, and quite bulky. It appears very substantial. That is, the arms and the legs are not spindly. They appear to be thick and muscular.
Or could this all just be a hoax?
In order to have this video be credible, I would expect to see a lot more thermal imagery through the trees. I wouldn't expect it to just completely disappear.
Stacy Brown Jr. claims the reason the clip ends is because the camera stopped working. So what does Meldrum think?
I know Stacy, actually, personally, and have visited with him. I have no reason to suspect that he contrived this. And so the only other question would be, is anyone foolish enough to traipse around buck naked in the dark?
Our verdict? Unknown creature. Given that this footage was filmed at night with an early generation thermal imaging camera, we don't quite have enough information to reach a definitive answer. But whether this was indeed the Florida skunk ape or merely a subspecies of Florida man with a proclivity for nocturnal nudism, we can say this: the situation definitely warrants further investigation. There have only been a handful of instances where someone reported seeing a juvenile Sasquatch. You're about to see one of them. A rare glimpse at what some are calling a baby Bigfoot. Take a look. May 23rd, 1997, the Catskill Mountains of New York, and Doug Pridgeon is filming his friends around a fire. It's a Friday night, and they're camped out for a nearby music festival, but they are not alone.
Are we filming now?
We're filming.
Okay, over here.
In the background of the footage, a shape emerges between the trees. It appears to be a small bipedal creature that proceeds to climb and swing from the branches. Look again, especially at that swinging motion.
This is not a dude in a suit. There's no way a person could imitate that kind of motion up in a tree. Most of those branches probably couldn't even support an adult human male's weight. That has to be an ape of some sort. I think that is a Sasquatch doing baby Sasquatch stuff up in a tree.
While reported sightings of young Sasquatch-like primates are rare, they do exist, including one story from British Columbia that dates all the way back to the 1800s.
The story goes that on the Trans-Canadian Railroad, the railroad workers saw a juvenile Sasquatch, even though they didn't call it that because the word didn't exist yet. They hit it with a rock, knocked it out, and basically captured it. People came and looked at it. A couple newspaper accounts depict how big it was, how tall it was. It wouldn't eat this, it would eat that, and then it disappears. Some people think that they are going to ship it back to the UK, and it died in transit and they threw it overboard. Dr. Grover Krantz suggested that perhaps P.T. Barnum bought it because it was around that time that Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy became part of the traveling circus for P.T. Barnum.
Barrickman also believes that if you look closely, you can actually see a potential mama Sasquatch in this footage.
Right there. Look at that. It's moving. It just moved back that direction. One of the most common misconceptions about Bigfoot is that it is an individual But it's not true. They clearly reproduce as any normal animal would. And right here, this is the proof of that. We have a larger one down below and a juvenile up in a tree.
Many Sasquatch researchers believe the reason juvenile Bigfoot sightings are so rarely documented may be the same reason you've probably never seen a baby pigeon or a baby squirrel. The mothers of these animals secretly protect their young offspring in secluded nests or shelters until the moment they are big and strong enough to reveal themselves to the outside world. Let's see if this potential baby Bigfoot is ready to reveal himself to our experts. Some question if this could possibly be a human child swinging on these branches.
The problem is humans, for all their agility, don't have the capability to cavort around amongst the branches of a tree as the individual that I witnessed in this film. That points to at least the infant being something other than human.
So, if it's not human, what about a small bear? Infant bears are known to climb trees, but Meldrum says this creature's anatomy is much closer to an ape's.
Its limb proportions aren't that different from a small chimpanzee. Either what we're looking at is something like a chimpanzee infant, or it is a young Sasquatch.
Private investigator Steve Culls was one of the first people to investigate this mysterious video.
We had to confirm, and we did with the property owner, that they did not allow any animals whatsoever on the property because of insurance purposes. I did make calls around to see if there was any escapes from zoos or medical laboratories, and there weren't.
We checked with wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka to see if she could shed any light on this potential primate.
So based on primate behavior, I would expect the young to be closer to the adult because primates, they tend to have fewer young, and the young tend to stay around the mother for a long period of time. I wouldn't expect it to be so far away from the mother in the trees. And I highly doubt that a mother with its young would bring it so close to people at an event like a music festival where there is a lot of noise and a lot of people there.
In fact, it is this behavior that makes Manka disagree with Meldrum on the potential identity of these creatures.
With bears, they love to scavenge on human foods. And in fact, a festival like this could even attract bears because they could realize that there's a lot of free food around for them to scavenge. Black bears can easily climb trees, and often moms will encourage their cubs to go up trees to protect them from predators. I think it's most likely a bear cub that's swinging in these branches and not a primate.
Our verdict? Unidentified animal. Manka thinks the creature's behavior says bear cub, while Meldrum thinks its limb proportions mean primate. Seems like the only thing our experts can agree on is that whatever this thing is, it certainly isn't human. With the proliferation of trail cams in America's forests, it's often asked why we haven't recorded a Sasquatch on one. Well, maybe we have, as you're about to see. September 16th, 2007, Ridgeway, Pennsylvania. Rick Jacobs fastens a motion-sensing camera in a remote section of the Allegheny National Forest, about 115 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. He's hoping to photograph deer that may be using the trail. But when he reviews the pictures he's captured, he sees this. Two furry bear cubs foraging at 20 hours, 4 minutes, 23 seconds. But check out this second image, taken 28 minutes later, where we see an ape-like animal from a rear side angle with its head obscured by its shoulders. In the third image, taken 30 seconds later, the animal, lean and elongated, appears to be smelling the ground near where deer attractant mix had been scattered. Field researcher Cliff Barrickman tells us that where these photos were taken is definitely Bigfoot country.
I've spoken to several witnesses who have seen Sasquatches just a few miles away from where this particular picture was taken. One gentleman was driving his van down the road when this thing came out of the forest, and you know what his number one observation was, besides the mass and the size of the thing, was the size of its butt. That's no coincidence. It's one of the prominent features. Bigfoot got back.
Bigfoot got back? As ridiculous as that may sound, it's consistent with that famous image of Patty we keep referencing, the alleged Sasquatch captured on the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Your butt muscles, which are the largest muscles in your body, are used for keeping your torso over your pelvis. And they're used for bipedal walking. That's why bears don't have big butt muscles. They're quadrupeds.
But wait, this creature doesn't have that same big hindquarters. So what gives?
All the other pictures that I think are real of Sasquatches have well-developed butt muscles, but yet this one does not.
Barrickman theorizes that it could be possible that what we are seeing is an underdeveloped specimen, a Bigfoot Jr., if you will.
This clearly would not be a full-size Sasquatch. It doesn't look like it's that big. And it is generally thought that Sasquatches lean a little bit more towards going on all fours when they're young.
The Bigfoot Field Research Organization agrees with Barrickman. Even though the derriere of this creature appears to be flat, similar to a bear's bottom, they claim the limb-to-torso ratio seen in these photos can only compare to a bipedal primate. Let's see what our experts think. We checked in with wildlife biologist Stephanie Manka.
I think it is most likely a bear, given the body shape and the body size. A younger bear, they're smaller, but they can have lengthier limbs and be a little bit thinner. The reasons why it doesn't look like a bear is because you can't clearly make out a snout, and that might be because of the angle of the head or the blurriness in the photo.
But even if the strange shape and size can be attributed to this being a young bear, its patchy exterior still looks a little odd.
I think that its skin is exposed because of mange. Mange is an insect-like arachnid. They're very tiny and they burrow into animals' skin. And this causes a lot of pain and itching. And if left untreated, the animal can lose a lot of hair and it can make the skin exposed and look scaly.
As we've seen, anatomist and Bigfoot expert Dr. Jeff Meldrum knows a thing or two about feet, and he agrees with Manka after spotting a key piece of evidence.
Those are the feet of a bear. They aren't the plantigrade feet of an ape. And if you adjust the lighting ever so slightly, guess what pops up? A tail. It has a short, stubby tail, which is a dead giveaway that it's a bear.
Meldrum suggests that if more frames from the trail camera were made available, the truth would have been immediately obvious.
There seems to be some cherry picking in the depiction of selected frames, and it's very misleading.
Our verdict, black bear. Our experts agree, and we're inclined to agree with them. There's really nothing big about these feet. This is most likely just a growing bear cub suffering from a nasty case of mange. However, we do know that trail cams are more prevalent than ever, so we'll be sure to bring you more relevant images as they come in. Several counties in Washington state have created Sasquatch preservation laws, making it illegal to hunt such a specimen, if ever discovered. However, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department actually stated that since Sasquatch is technically not on the endangered species list, it is legally open season on any pesky Bigfoots. And after hearing the sounds in our next story, I can understand why some Texas residents may be getting itchy trigger fingers. It's January 2022, and Boyd Sims, a Proof is Out There viewer, is on a month-long expedition 50 miles north of Houston, Texas, in the Sam Houston National Forest. He is there to record wildlife sounds, and what he discovers is music to his ears.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was shocked. I was in shock.
Boyd has made dozens of strange recordings of what he describes as Bigfoot calls.
I spent years looking for explanations of the audio recordings I have and can't find any animal that makes any of the sounds that I have recorded. Sasquatch is definitely here in Texas.
This area of the country has a ton of Bigfoot reports out of it, dating back into the 1800s. I have personally spoken to a dozen or two people that have seen Sasquatches in this area. One fisherman found footprints. They were about 13 inches.
In fact, there are more than 40 Sasquatch reports a year inside the Sam Houston National Forest.
That's a pretty significant number of people that have seen Sasquatches in this area.
Boyd's recordings are hardly the first time an alleged Bigfoot sound was captured. Made in the early 1970s, the Sierra sound recordings are touted as the gold standard of evidence for Bigfoot language. According to one respected linguist, these sounds captured in California's Sierra Nevada mountains reveal an actual intelligent conversation in an, as of yet, undocumented language. Could we be hearing more evidence of Bigfoot talking in Boyd's recordings? We'll let our expert sound off.
The whoops may be the means by which males and females of this relatively solitary, widely dispersed, very rare species find a mate. These loud calls are probably territorial. By comparison, large male orangutans broadcast their territory by a loud, raucous call that booms out through the jungle. They've even developed extensive laryngeal air sacs that act as almost like amplifiers. And so it stands to reason that perhaps Sasquatch have these same air sacs.
Meldrum suggests that these air sacs may also enable Sasquatches to produce infrasound, a low-frequency sound used by animals such as elephants and whales. These sounds allow animals to communicate at great distances and can even affect the physiology of the listener.
It can cause the stimulation of receptors in the brain that will evoke fear and trepidation, as well as other emotions. I've talked to witnesses who said, that their very core vibrated from the intensity and the pitch of these sounds.
Could Sasquatches possibly be using infrasound to keep people away as a desperate effort to keep their dwindling species alive? We checked in with forensic audio analyst Dr. Robert Maher, who first compares the recording to known animals found in the area, starting with the wild boar.
It's making a kind of a chirpy kind of sound rather than a long howl like the Sam Houston recording.
If it's not a boar, could it be another local animal like the fox? Maher doesn't think so.
Rather than being a howl, it's much more of a modulating kind of thing. So it didn't seem like the fox would be a likely candidate.
However, when it comes to the coyote,
we can see the sound starts at a lower pitch, goes up, and then sustains at that level. And that's similar to what we heard in the Sam Houston recording. I can't say that it's absolutely certain, but it's similar enough that I think that's a possibility.
Okay, so maybe a coyote. But what about the big man himself? Maher checks for a Bigfoot match using the popular Sierra sounds.
We see a continuous sort of tone, but it's very short in duration and tends to be more of a yippy quality, where the observation in Sam Houston was more of a howl. The characteristics are different enough that they're not the same source.
Our verdict? Unknown animal noises. While we have ruled out most of the local wildlife, the coyote was similar, but not a clear match, and the Sierra sounds had a different tone. Nothing lined up well enough to make a clear call. But if you ever find yourself in the Sam Houston National Forest like Boyd, be prepared for something strange to happen. Be prepared to record it, and be prepared to run. We'll conclude our special Bigfoot episode with a question. We know how people behave when they think they've seen Bigfoot, but how would Bigfoot behave when he sees people? One intrepid family claims they found out the hard way. It's April 2009, and Chuck Newton has taken his young son into the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia to have some fun with the family's ATV. Chuck barrels over rocks in the ravine, showing off for his young son, when suddenly something strange appears, a hairy humanoid crossing their path nonchalantly. Chuck stops cold in his tracks.
What was that?
It's a wide shot, so let's push in and slow down so you can get a better look. We see that it's a bipedal figure that appears to be very large from this perspective, possibly exceeding 7 feet in height.
What was that?
Field researcher Cliff Barrickman says Bigfoot sightings in this area go all the way back to Native Americans.
In Virginia, the Cherokee people had stories of giant hair-covered people-like things in the woods. They were doing the same sort of things as the people of the Pacific Northwest described. The most reasonable explanation for these different people describing the same animals is that they were describing the same animals. Sasquatches have a continent-wide distribution.
During the turn of the 20th century, local newspapers in the area reported on strange Sasquatch encounters.
An old newspaper report from 1892 reports a large upright being with thick hair covering its head and shoulders. But the word Sasquatch didn't exist then. They chose to call it the wood booger.
The wood booger was rumored to be a horrifying sight that was known to carry away small children who wandered off in the night.
And booger, or wood booger, actually shares some of the same word roots as boogeyman and are used in much of the same way. A lot of times people will say, "Now you don't go out in the woods at night because the booger will get you."
Although this video has its fair share of skeptics, Barrickman thinks this could be real.
I find Chuck's reaction to be very natural, unstaged. When he turns and looks at the camera and points it, "Did you see that?" And then he immediately looks back and watches the animal as it walks away. I find that many times hoaxers focus on the camera itself instead of at this amazing thing that they just saw that was unexpected right in front of them. I've had the opportunity to go to this location with the witness, Chuck, and I found him to be very believable.
Interesting fact, Sasquatch sightings gained momentum in the American South right after the Civil War. One theory is that Confederate soldiers who refused to surrender and hid out in the woods were being mistaken for these hairy creatures. Of course, that doesn't explain the older Native American legends. Let's see what our experts have to say.
The creature that we're seeing in this video is clearly bipedal. The only other animal in this area that would be able to walk bipedally would be a bear walking on its hind legs. But when they do, they typically waddle more and take shorter steps. This being is clearly taking larger steps than a black bear would.
So if it's not a bear, could we be looking at a real-life Bigfoot? Biologist Floyd Hayes isn't so sure.
I'm just a little astonished to see that it's just casually crossing the stream. Doesn't seem to be the least bit concerned about this loud, noisy vehicle that's approaching it. I think this is either a human being in an ape-like costume that's crossing the river, or it is a fabricated video.
Anatomy professor Dr. Jeff Meldrum disagrees. He finds that this behavior could be perfectly acceptable for a Sasquatch.
The two most common circumstances under which encounters occur are on roads or near water. And so here we have the latter, and even an ATV trudging up that creek bed might not have sounded as intrusive or intimidating as it would otherwise, given the muffling effect of the white noise of the stream. The witness interaction with the videographer is also very spontaneous, very natural, very convincing.
What was that?
And as for this being a man in a suit, Meldrum is doubtful, but is hesitant to make the call without evidence of the actual scale of this creature.
I would probably put it at no more than 7 feet. All these off-the-shelf costumes are made for average people, but they're not made for a 7 or 8 foot tall person. So if we could establish larger size, that would certainly lessen the chances of it being someone donning a costume.
I remember the first time I watched The Proof Is Out There late at night with the volume slightly lowered, as if the mysteries on screen might overhear me and decide to answer back. And that sensation is exactly where this story begins, with a man named Daniel Cross, a methodical researcher who believes that truth is not loud but persistent, who has spent years studying unexplained footage with the calm patience of someone who understands that reality rarely announces itself clearly, and when. The series opens with its familiar promise to examine the strangest evidence in the world. Daniel feels a pull he cannot explain, because among the lights in the forest, the strange sounds, and the grainy images that populate the show, there is one recurring presence that refuses to stay buried: Bigfoot, not as a carnival monster but as a question that keeps returning in different forms, different decades, and different witnesses, and Daniel, unlike many viewers, does not feel excitement or fear, only a quiet professional irritation that something unresolved has been left on the table for too long. The episode titled The Bigfoot Files presents a series of clips and testimonies that at first glance seem familiar: hikers startled by movement between trees, hunters hearing vocalizations that do not match any known animal, and the inevitable blurry silhouette crossing a ridge line. But what grips Daniel is not the footage itself, it is the consistency of small details that the show's experts point out almost casually. The stride length that does not match a human, the shoulder width that remains constant across different sightings separated by years, the way the subject seems to know where cameras are least effective, and as the narrators dissect the evidence with scientific restraint, Daniel begins to feel that the show is not merely entertaining speculation but an invitation, a challenge to anyone watching closely enough to continue the work. He pauses the screen repeatedly, rewinding segments where a thermal image shows a large bipedal heat signature moving with unsettling efficiency through dense terrain, and he notices how the commentators do not jump to conclusions but also do not dismiss the data, and this balance resonates deeply with his own approach to the unknown, which is why, after the episode ends, Daniel does not turn off the television but sits in the dark, reflecting on the idea that absence of proof is not proof of absence, a phrase often abused yet here presented with restraint, and he realizes that the series has quietly planted a seed. In the days that follow, Daniel revisits older episodes, paying particular attention to how The Proof Is Out There treats Bigfoot not as folklore but as an unresolved scientific anomaly, something that exists in the margins of established knowledge, and he begins compiling his own notes, creating a private file he names the Bigfoot Files, borrowing the title from the episode but imbuing it with personal meaning, because for him this is no longer about television but about patterns. He notices that many sightings occur near liminal spaces, areas where human infrastructure meets deep wilderness, logging roads that fade into forest, abandoned mining routes, national parks with histories of sudden disappearances that remain officially unrelated, and he recalls how the show carefully avoids sensationalism, instead focusing on environmental data, witness credibility, and the limits of current tracking technology, and this methodology convinces him that if something is there, it is not supernatural, it is biological, intelligent, and deeply adapted to avoiding us. One night, as rain taps against his window, Daniel replays a segment where a former park ranger describes finding footprints that appear overnight and vanish by morning, not washed away but simply gone, and the ranger's calm voice, stripped of drama, unsettles Daniel more than any scream would, because it suggests a presence that operates with intention, and he starts to wonder whether Bigfoot, if real, is not hiding out of fear but out of indifference, regarding humans as noisy intrusions to be observed and avoided. The proof is out there does something subtle yet powerful in this episode. It reframes the question from, is Bigfoot real, to, why does the evidence persist? And Daniel realizes that this shift mirrors his own intellectual frustration, because hoaxes can be explained, misidentifications can be corrected, but persistence across time, geography, and technology requires a more complex explanation. And as he pores over the show's breakdown of audio recordings, particularly low-frequency vocalizations captured in remote forests, he notes how the experts point out structures in the sounds that resemble communication rather than random noise, a point that the series presents cautiously but clearly, and Daniel feels a chill that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. He remembers a moment from his childhood when he camped with his father and heard something move through the trees at night, heavy and deliberate, too large to be a deer, too controlled to be a bear, and how his father dismissed it with a shrug, and for years Daniel accepted that dismissal without question, but now, guided by the calm analytical tone of the proof is out there, he re-examines that memory not as proof but as data, subjective yet emotionally consistent with hundreds of other accounts the show presents. The episode also explores skepticism, featuring scientists who argue that no large primate could remain undiscovered in North America, and Daniel appreciates that the series gives these voices equal weight, but he also notes how the counterarguments rely heavily on assumptions about human observational dominance, assumptions that crumble when confronted with how much of the natural world remains poorly monitored. And the show's experts emphasize that discovery is often a matter of opportunity rather than existence, a point that Daniel underlines in his notes with unusual force. As the night deepens, Daniel's file grows thicker, filled with timestamps, quotes, and cross-references to ecological studies mentioned briefly in the episode, and he realizes that the proof is out there has achieved something rare. It has made him feel that engaging with the mystery is not an act of belief but of responsibility, as if ignoring the question would be intellectually dishonest. He imagines Bigfoot not as a singular creature but as a population, small, intelligent, and strategically elusive, and this idea aligns disturbingly well with the show's refusal to reduce the phenomenon to a single piece of footage or a definitive moment, instead presenting it as an accumulation of unresolved signals, and Daniel finds himself respecting that restraint deeply. By the time dawn approaches, he understands that this is only the beginning, that the Bigfoot files he has started compiling will not end with a neat conclusion, because the truth, if it exists, will not arrive as a revelation but as a convergence of small, stubborn facts, much like the show itself, and he smiles faintly at the thought that somewhere, perhaps watching from the shadows of a forest just waking to morning light, the subject of all this analysis continues on, unseen, unconcerned, and undeniably present in the data that refuses to disappear. Daniel Cross did not intend for his interest to deepen, yet the second phase of his obsession began the moment he realized that the proof is out there was not merely cataloging anomalies but quietly mapping the boundaries of human certainty, and this realization followed him into his daily routines, into the sterile brightness of his office where multiple monitors displayed satellite imagery, wildlife databases, and archived footage pulled from public records, and as he reviewed them, he felt the subtle influence of the show shaping the way he looked at information, urging patience instead of dismissal. In the days after watching the Bigfoot Files episode, Daniel rewatched it not as a viewer but as a participant, pausing when the panel of experts examined a stabilized clip of a figure moving uphill with a gait that conservation biologists described as energy efficient for a body mass far exceeding that of a human, and he noted how the show carefully avoided stating conclusions, instead letting the physics of movement speak for itself, and this restraint convinced him more than any bold claim ever could. He began tracing the geographic references mentioned in the episode, plotting them onto a digital map, discovering clusters not random but following mountain ranges, river systems, and migration corridors known to wildlife researchers, and this pattern fascinated him because it suggested not chaos but behavior, and behavior implied cognition. The proof is out there had briefly mentioned indigenous oral histories, not as proof but as cultural context, and Daniel returned to that segment with renewed attention, listening to elders describe forest beings not as monsters but as neighbors who existed alongside humans before roads and boundaries, and the show's respectful tone prevented these accounts from slipping into caricature, instead framing them as long-term observational records encoded in story. Daniel found himself wondering how much data modern science dismisses simply because it does not arrive in spreadsheets, and this question lingered uncomfortably as he recalled how often Western research paradigms assume novelty equals discovery. One evening, while the show played silently in the background during a replay of the episode, Daniel received an email from a colleague who specialized in bioacoustics, someone he trusted deeply, who mentioned in passing that certain low-frequency sounds recorded in the Pacific Northwest had defied easy classification, and Daniel felt a spark of recognition because the proof is out there had analyzed similar recordings, highlighting rhythmic structures and call-and-response patterns inconsistent with known fauna. The show had not claimed intelligence, but it had raised the possibility, and Daniel realized that this possibility, once acknowledged, changed everything, because an intelligent species capable of avoiding detection would not be constrained by the assumptions used to argue its impossibility. He returned to the show's segment where a former military analyst explained how even advanced surveillance struggles in dense forest environments, especially against a target that understands terrain intimately, and Daniel appreciated how the series used expertise not to dazzle but to contextualize, reminding viewers that technology has limits shaped by environment and expectation. This insight bled into Daniel's own thinking as he began examining cases dismissed as hoaxes, noticing that many were thrown out not because of definitive debunking but because they did not fit existing models, and the proof is out there had subtly criticized this tendency by presenting debunkings alongside unresolved cases, allowing ambiguity to remain without shame. Daniel's personal file expanded, now including transcripts of the show's expert commentary, annotated with his reflections on how certainty often masquerades as skepticism, and he felt an intellectual humility creeping in, a sense that the question of Bigfoot was not about proving existence but about interrogating the frameworks that determine what counts as acceptable evidence. Late one night, as he watched the episode again, Daniel focused on a brief moment most viewers likely overlooked, a clip showing thermal footage where the heat signature briefly stopped, turned its head toward the camera, and then altered its path to disappear into denser cover, and the show's experts debated whether this was coincidence or awareness, never deciding, yet Daniel felt that the ambiguity itself was the point, because the behavior mirrored exactly how humans react when they sense observation, and this parallel unsettled him deeply. He remembered how the proof is out there had emphasized that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, yet the episode also challenged viewers to consider what happens when extraordinary evidence exists but is fragmented, distributed across time and geography, never coalescing into a single undeniable moment. And Daniel realized that this fragmentation might not be accidental but inherent to the phenomenon. The show also explored the psychological dimension, discussing why humans are drawn to figures like Bigfoot, and Daniel initially bristled at this, fearing it would reduce the topic to projection, but instead the analysis was thoughtful, suggesting that fascination arises not from desire to believe but from discomfort with the unknown persisting in a mapped world, and Daniel recognized himself in that discomfort. He began to see the Bigfoot files not as an episode but as a case study in epistemology, a reflection on how knowledge is constructed and defended, and this realization made his work feel suddenly urgent, as if ignoring the question would be an abdication of intellectual integrity. He took a brief trip to a nearby national forest, not with the intention of finding anything, but to experience the environment discussed so often on the show, and as he walked among towering trees, he felt the scale of the landscape dwarfing him, making human presence feel temporary and fragile, and he understood viscerally what the proof is out there had tried to convey through expert testimony, that vastness itself is a form of concealment. Standing there, he recalled the episode's mention of missing person cases tangentially linked to remote forests, carefully handled to avoid sensationalism, and Daniel appreciated that restraint because it acknowledged tragedy without exploiting it, yet it also reinforced the idea that wilderness operates under rules indifferent to human narratives. As dusk settled, Daniel felt no fear, only a heightened awareness, and he realized that this awareness, this sense of being observed without evidence, was perhaps the emotional core of the Bigfoot phenomenon, something the proof is out there captured expertly without naming directly. Back home, Daniel resumed his analysis with renewed clarity, now convinced that the question was not whether Bigfoot exists, but whether humanity is prepared to accept the existence of something intelligent that chooses to remain unseen, and this question echoed through his mind as he watched the episode one final time before shelving it mentally, knowing he would return to it again. The Bigfoot files he was assembling had begun to feel less like an investigation and more like a dialogue with uncertainty, and Daniel sensed that this dialogue was far from over, that the series had only opened the door, and what lay beyond would challenge not just science but the quiet arrogance with which humans assume they have already found everything worth finding. Daniel Cross began to understand that what the proof is out there had truly done was not awaken curiosity but dismantle comfort, because once the idea of an unseen intelligence took root, it quietly rewired the way he interpreted silence, absence, and denial, and this shift followed him into the third stage of his engagement with the Bigfoot question, a stage marked not by new footage but by reevaluation of human behavior itself. He returned again to the Bigfoot Files episode, this time focusing less on the creature and more on the people presented within it, the witnesses whose testimonies were dissected with careful neutrality, and he noticed how the show emphasized consistency over drama, noting how credible witnesses often struggled to articulate what they saw, not embellishing but hesitating, searching for language adequate to an experience that resisted categorization. Daniel found this deeply persuasive, because fabricated stories tend to flow too smoothly, whereas genuine encounters fracture speech, and the proof is out there highlighted this fracture without exploiting it. He replayed a segment where a former law enforcement officer described seeing a massive figure cross a fire road at dusk, and the show's analysts focused not on the size but on the officer's immediate reaction, how he froze instead of reaching for a weapon or camera, a response consistent with cognitive overload rather than fear or excitement, and Daniel scribbled notes about involuntary behavior, realizing that the episode was quietly teaching viewers how to evaluate testimony beyond surface content. This realization led him to revisit psychological literature on perception under stress, and he found parallels between these studies and the witness accounts presented on the show, strengthening his sense that the phenomenon was being approached responsibly, not sensationally. As days passed, Daniel began assembling timelines, aligning sightings discussed in the episode with environmental factors such as seasonal migration of prey animals, forest fire activity, and human encroachment, and patterns emerged that the proof is out there had hinted at but not fully explored, suggesting that sightings increased during periods of ecological disruption. And this insight reframed Bigfoot not as a lurking monster but as a displaced presence responding to human activity. The episode had briefly touched on this idea, mentioning how deforestation and expanding infrastructure might push elusive species into brief contact with humans, and Daniel now saw this as a crucial point, one that transformed the mystery into a commentary on coexistence rather than intrusion. He recalled how the show featured a wildlife biologist who noted that many species once thought mythical were later confirmed once technology and perspective caught up, and Daniel appreciated how this historical context grounded the discussion, reminding viewers that scientific humility is not weakness but accuracy over time. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel listened again to the audio recordings featured in the episode, this time through professional headphones, isolating frequencies the show's experts had discussed, and he felt a strange mix of awe and unease as he recognized structural repetition in the sounds, patterns too deliberate to dismiss casually, and although the proof is out there had refrained from labeling them as language, Daniel understood that structure itself was the unsettling element. He imagined an intelligence shaped not by civilization but by wilderness, one that had evolved parallel to humanity yet diverged in priorities, valuing concealment over dominance, adaptation over expansion, and this idea aligned disturbingly well with the show's recurring theme that survival does not require visibility. The episode had also examined alleged physical evidence, hair samples, and footprints, often debunked yet occasionally unresolved, and Daniel noticed how the show treated unresolved cases not as failures but as placeholders, reminders that not all data fits neatly into existing categories, and this resonated with his growing belief that the Bigfoot phenomenon occupied a liminal scientific space, neither proven nor disproven, and therefore intellectually honest to engage with cautiously. He began to question why society demands definitive proof for some claims while accepting probabilistic reasoning for others, a tension the show subtly exposed by juxtaposing skepticism with open inquiry, and Daniel realized that this tension was less about Bigfoot and more about human discomfort with ambiguity. During a quiet afternoon, Daniel rewatched a portion of the episode where the panel discussed camera traps, explaining how even well-funded conservation efforts struggle to capture rare species, and he recalled documented cases of animals like snow leopards evading detection for decades despite active searches, and this parallel strengthened his conviction that absence of imagery did not equate to absence of existence. The proof is out there had used these examples sparingly, never overstating their relevance, yet Daniel found their implication powerful, because they dismantled the assumption that modern surveillance guarantees discovery. He found himself increasingly frustrated with dismissive rhetoric surrounding Bigfoot, rhetoric that relied more on ridicule than analysis, and he appreciated how the show refused to participate in that tone, choosing instead to model intellectual patience. As his thoughts deepened, Daniel noticed a shift within himself, a growing sense that the Bigfoot files he was compiling were no longer about solving a mystery but about documenting a boundary, the edge of what humans are willing to accept as possible, and this boundary fascinated him more than the creature itself. He remembered a segment where the show discussed hoaxes, carefully explaining how some fabricated evidence undermined genuine inquiry, and Daniel respected this transparency, understanding that acknowledging falsehoods strengthened rather than weakened the case for continued investigation. He reflected on how the proof is out there balanced skepticism and curiosity with remarkable discipline, and he wondered whether this balance was the real lesson, a model for engaging with the unknown without surrendering rigor. Late one evening, while reviewing his notes, Daniel realized that his emotional response to the topic had evolved from intrigue to something quieter and more profound, a sense of humility in the face of complexity, and he suspected that this was the emotional arc the show intended, even if implicitly. The Bigfoot Files episode did not promise answers, it promised a process, and Daniel now understood that process as an invitation to rethink certainty itself. He imagined future generations looking back at this era, perhaps laughing at the idea that Bigfoot was once controversial, or perhaps still debating it, and neither possibility seemed equally plausible, underscoring how provisional all knowledge truly is. As he closed his laptop and sat in the silence of his apartment, Daniel felt no urgency to prove anything, only a quiet resolve to keep asking better questions, and he recognized that this resolve was the true legacy of The Proof Is Out There, transforming mystery from spectacle into discipline. The Bigfoot files had become, for him, a mirror reflecting not what lurked in the forests but what lingered in the human mind when confronted with the possibility that the world is still larger and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. By the time Daniel Cross reached what he privately labeled the fourth phase of his inquiry, he no longer felt as though he was chasing a mystery but rather being gradually reshaped by it, because The Proof Is Out There had done something subtle and enduring. It had trained his attention, and attention, he was beginning to realize, was the most dangerous tool in the presence of the unknown. He returned once more to the Bigfoot Files episode, not to re-examine the footage or the expert commentary, but to observe his own reactions to it, noting how moments that once sparked excitement now produced calm focus, and moments that once seemed insignificant now carried disproportionate weight, particularly the pauses, the silences, the hesitations that the show left intact rather than editing away. He noticed how the narration frequently allowed space for doubt to breathe, how it avoided guiding the viewer toward emotional conclusions, and Daniel began to see this restraint as an ethical stance, a refusal to colonize mystery with certainty. This realization bled into his broader thinking about how humans engage with the unexplained, and he found himself questioning the impulse to conquer every unknown with explanation, wondering whether some phenomena persist precisely because they resist domination rather than understanding. The episode's recurring emphasis on pattern recognition resurfaced in his thoughts, especially the way the show demonstrated that Bigfoot sightings often cluster around transitional zones, ecological edges where one environment gives way to another, and Daniel found this symbolically resonant, because his own thinking now occupied a similar edge between skepticism and openness. He began correlating the show's data points with anthropological research on liminal beings across cultures, entities that appear not as threats but as markers of boundary, and while The Proof Is Out There never ventured into mythology, Daniel recognized that the persistence of such figures across human history might reflect an enduring cognitive relationship with the unknown rather than a singular biological claim. Yet he resisted letting this drift into abstraction, grounding himself repeatedly in the episode's insistence on physical evidence, measurable data, and methodological rigor, and this tension between symbolic meaning and empirical inquiry became central to his evolving understanding. One night, Daniel focused intently on a segment where the show dissected a long-disputed piece of footage, stabilizing it frame by frame, overlaying skeletal motion models to test whether a human could plausibly replicate the movement without mechanical assistance, and he was struck not by the conclusion, which remained cautiously inconclusive, but by the process itself, because it demonstrated respect for the question, treating it as worthy of effort even in the absence of definitive answers. He realized that this respect was what differentiated The Proof Is Out There from countless other programs, and it was this respect that now guided his own work. Daniel began interviewing people, not publicly, but quietly, colleagues and acquaintances who had spent time in remote environments, forestry workers, surveyors, search and rescue volunteers, and he noticed a pattern similar to the one highlighted on the show, that those with the most experience were the least eager to sensationalize, often speaking reluctantly about moments they could not fully explain. Moments they had compartmentalized rather than shared, and Daniel recognized in them the same fractured language the show had analyzed, the same careful avoidance of exaggeration. He documented these conversations not as evidence but as context, understanding that the Bigfoot files he was assembling were as much about human response as about the phenomenon itself. The episode's discussion of intelligence continued to echo in his mind, particularly the suggestion that an intelligent species might actively avoid leaving evidence, and Daniel found himself reconsidering the very definition of proof, questioning whether proof must always be tangible or whether consistent absence under conditions of intense scrutiny might itself be informative. This line of thought unsettled him, because it inverted the logic of investigation, and yet it aligned disturbingly well with the show's portrayal of a subject that seems always one step ahead of observation. He recalled a moment in the episode where an expert explained how human perception is biased toward movement and novelty, and Daniel wondered whether Bigfoot's elusiveness might be a product of behavioral strategies that exploit these biases, remaining still when watched, moving only when unseen, and this idea felt less fantastical than it once would have. As his thinking deepened, Daniel noticed changes in his emotional landscape, a diminishing need for resolution, replaced by a growing appreciation for uncertainty as a stable state rather than a temporary inconvenience. The Proof Is Out There had modeled this attitude repeatedly, ending segments without dramatic conclusions, allowing questions to remain open, and Daniel now understood that this was not indecision but discipline. He revisited the show's treatment of debunkers, noting how their arguments were presented fairly yet without triumphalism, and he appreciated that skepticism was framed not as an endpoint but as a tool, one that must be applied consistently rather than selectively. This consistency became a guiding principle for Daniel as he reviewed his own assumptions, acknowledging moments where disbelief had served more as emotional comfort than analytical rigor. During a solitary hike through a forest trail near his home, Daniel experienced a moment of heightened awareness similar to those described on the show, a sudden sense of presence without visible cause, and although he saw nothing and heard nothing unusual, he recognized the psychological mechanics at play, understanding how such moments could imprint themselves deeply without yielding concrete evidence. Instead of dismissing the experience or elevating it to significance, he treated it as data about perception itself, and he smiled at the thought that this measured response was something the Proof Is Out There had taught him implicitly. Returning home, he watched the episode again, this time paying attention to its pacing, the way it allowed viewers time to think, and he realized that the show was not attempting to convince but to accompany, walking alongside the audience as they navigated ambiguity. This companionship felt rare in a media landscape driven by certainty and outrage, and Daniel felt grateful for it, even as it left him with more questions than answers. The Bigfoot files he was compiling now felt less like a case file and more like a philosophical ledger, documenting shifts in understanding rather than discoveries, and he recognized that this evolution mirrored the show's quiet thesis, that the most important revelations often occur not in the world but in the frameworks we use to interpret it. As weeks passed, Daniel noticed that his conversations with others had changed, becoming less declarative and more exploratory, and he traced this change directly to the influence of The Proof Is Out There, which had demonstrated that intellectual courage sometimes means resisting the urge to conclude. He thought about how Bigfoot, whether real or not, functioned as a test case for this courage, exposing the fragility of certainty in the face of persistent anomaly. Late one evening, as he reviewed his notes, Daniel felt a sense of equilibrium settle over him, a balance between curiosity and restraint, and he understood that this balance was the true achievement of the journey so far. The Bigfoot files had not brought him closer to an answer, but they had brought him closer to a way of thinking capable of living with the question, and in that quiet acceptance, Daniel sensed that the investigation was only beginning, not because there was more to prove, but because there was more to understand about how humans stand at the edge. of the unknown and decide whether to look away or remain present. Daniel cross-entered what he would later recognize as the fifth movement of his long intellectual descent, not because of any new episode of The Proof Is Out There but because of an absence, a silence that settled in after weeks of immersion, and it was within that silence that the ideas seeded by the Bigfoot Files episode began to reorganize themselves into something heavier, something no longer abstract. Because the more Daniel reflected on the material, the more he realized that the phenomenon was exerting pressure not on the boundaries of science but on the assumptions of human dominance embedded quietly within it. He revisited the episode again, almost ritualistically now, and focused on the way the show framed humanity not as the central observer of nature but as one of many participants within it, a framing that subtly undermined the unspoken belief that if something significant existed, humans would have already cataloged it. The Proof Is Out There did not argue this point overtly, yet it demonstrated it repeatedly through examples of oversight, misclassification, and delayed discovery, and Daniel found this approach far more unsettling than any dramatic claim could have been, because it suggested that invisibility might be a function of perspective rather than absence. He began to notice how often the show returned to the concept of scale, not only physical scale but temporal and cognitive scale, emphasizing how brief human observation windows are compared to evolutionary timelines, and Daniel realized that Bigfoot, if real, would not be an anomaly but an inevitability, a product of adaptive intelligence shaped by environments far older and more patient than modern civilization. This realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility that humanity's insistence on evidence might sometimes serve less as a pursuit of truth and more as a defense against humility, a way to reaffirm control in a world that feels increasingly mapped and diminished. The episode's careful breakdown of tracking failures replayed in his mind, experts explaining how even experienced researchers can miss large animals repeatedly due to terrain complexity, weather, and behavioral adaptation, and Daniel found himself re-examining the confidence with which skeptics dismissed the idea of an undiscovered hominid, recognizing that such confidence often rested on abstract probability rather than lived ecological complexity. He thought about how The Proof Is Out There had highlighted that intelligence is not monolithic, that problem-solving, spatial awareness, and avoidance behaviors can evolve independently of tool use or language as humans define it, and this reframing destabilized the hierarchy that placed human cognition at the apex by default. As Daniel sat surrounded by his expanding archive of notes, transcripts, and reflections, he realized that the Bigfoot Files had transformed from an investigation into a confrontation with anthropocentrism, and this confrontation left him unsettled because it exposed how deeply the assumption of human centrality shaped even skeptical reasoning. The show's restraint continued to impress him, particularly its refusal to exploit fear, and Daniel recognized that fear, when present, arose not from the idea of Bigfoot itself but from the implication that humans might not be alone at the top of the cognitive food chain, an implication that the episode allowed to linger without commentary. He began to read ecological philosophy alongside his scientific sources, finding resonance between the show's tone and theories that argued for decentering humanity within natural systems, and he understood that The Proof Is Out There was operating quietly within this philosophical current, using empirical investigation as a means of challenging cultural assumptions rather than reinforcing them. One segment from the episode resurfaced repeatedly in his thoughts, a discussion of how primates exhibit diverse social structures and adaptive strategies, and how intelligence expresses itself differently across species, and Daniel found himself imagining a hominid lineage that diverged from humanity not in inferiority but in direction, prioritizing concealment, environmental integration, and minimal impact over expansion and alteration, and this imagined lineage felt disturbingly plausible. He recalled how the show had emphasized that Bigfoot sightings rarely involve aggression, a point often overshadowed by sensational narratives, and Daniel considered the significance of this, recognizing that non-aggression paired with avoidance suggested not primitiveness but restraint, a conscious choice rather than a lack of capacity. The more he reflected, the more the idea took shape that Bigfoot, if it existed, might represent not a missing link but an alternative outcome, a mirror held up to humanity showing what might have been possible had different values guided evolutionary success. This thought did not feel romantic to Daniel, nor did it feel condemning, but it did feel destabilizing, because it reframed the mystery from a hunt for proof into an ethical question about coexistence and recognition. The proof is out there had never asked viewers to believe, yet it had asked them to consider, and Daniel now understood that consideration itself carried weight, because to consider the existence of another intelligent being sharing the same landscape was to implicitly question the moral framework that justified humanity's unchallenged claim to dominance. He found himself increasingly sensitive to how the episode discussed land use, habitat loss, and human expansion, noting how these topics were woven into the Bigfoot discussion without accusation, simply as context, and Daniel appreciated this subtlety because it allowed the implications to emerge organically rather than defensively. During a long walk through an urban park, Daniel observed how people moved through green spaces with a sense of ownership rather than presence, and he contrasted this with the show's portrayal of wilderness as something that persists despite observation, and this contrast sharpened his awareness of how civilization frames nature as a resource rather than a community. He realized that the Bigfoot files were not pushing him toward belief in a creature but toward a reevaluation of humanity's relationship with the unknown, a relationship characterized by either conquest or denial, rarely coexistence. The episode's repeated emphasis on unresolved evidence began to feel less like a flaw and more like a feature, a deliberate refusal to provide closure that mirrored the open-endedness of the natural world itself, and Daniel found this approach increasingly admirable as he compared it to media narratives that sought to package mystery into consumable certainty. He returned to the show's closing remarks, where the narrator emphasized that the absence of definitive answers did not invalidate the question, and Daniel felt this sentiment crystallize within him as a guiding principle, applicable far beyond the Bigfoot phenomenon. As weeks passed, Daniel noticed that his professional work had begun to reflect this shift, his analyses becoming more tentative, more conditional, and paradoxically more rigorous, because he was now more attentive to the limits of inference and the dangers of overconfidence. He recognized that this change was not comfortable, as it stripped away the reassuring solidity of firm conclusions, yet it felt intellectually honest in a way that certainty often did not. The Bigfoot Files episode had accomplished this transformation without preaching, simply by modeling a disciplined engagement with uncertainty, and Daniel now saw that discipline as a rare and valuable skill. One evening, as he reread his earliest notes, he was struck by how different his initial tone had been, sharper, more detached, more eager to categorize, and he felt a quiet gratitude for the journey that had softened that edge without dulling his critical faculties. He realized that the mystery no longer felt external, something out there to be solved, but internal, a test of how he responded to the limits of knowledge, and this realization felt both sobering and liberating. The proof is out there had not expanded his understanding of Bigfoot in any definitive way, but it had expanded his understanding of inquiry itself, revealing how the pursuit of truth is shaped as much by humility as by evidence. As Daniel closed his files late one night, he felt no urgency to resolve the question, only a steady commitment to remain attentive, to resist the temptation of dismissal or belief, and to inhabit the space between with integrity. The Bigfoot files had become, for him, a record not of sightings or sounds but of an evolving mindset, one that acknowledged that the most profound discoveries may not announce themselves with clarity, but instead emerge slowly through sustained attention to what refuses to disappear. Daniel Cross reached the 6th stage of his immersion not through revelation but through friction, a subtle resistance that began to form between his evolving perspective and the world around him, because as the proof is out there continued to echo in his thinking, he found that ordinary conversations about certainty, evidence, and dismissal now felt strangely incomplete, as if something essential were being left unsaid. And this tension marked a turning point in his relationship with the Bigfoot files. He no longer experienced the material as external content to be analyzed but as a lens that altered how he interpreted human behavior, particularly the reflexive need to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible, and he traced this reflex back to the cultural habits the show had quietly exposed without accusation. Rewatching the episode again, Daniel focused on how the experts often paused before speaking, allowing silence to linger in a way that television usually avoids, and he realized that these pauses were not empty but deliberate, creating space for viewers to think rather than react, and this technique struck him as profoundly at odds with the accelerated pace of modern discourse. He began to wonder whether the persistence of the Bigfoot phenomenon was not only about an elusive subject, but also about a cultural impatience that refused to grant mystery the time it requires to be understood, preferring either belief or dismissal to sustained attention. This idea followed him into his professional environment, where he noticed how quickly complex problems were flattened into conclusions for the sake of efficiency, and he recognized in this tendency the same logic that declared Bigfoot impossible based on incomplete models. The Proof is Out There had emphasized repeatedly that models are tools, not truths, and Daniel now saw how easily tools harden into dogma when left unexamined. He revisited the episode's discussion of ecological blind spots, particularly how large swaths of wilderness remain under-monitored despite the illusion of comprehensive surveillance, and he found himself thinking less about forests and more about intellectual landscapes, areas of inquiry neglected because they challenge foundational assumptions. The show's calm insistence that not knowing is not the same as being wrong began to feel almost radical to him, and he recognized that this principle, applied consistently, destabilized many comfortable hierarchies of knowledge. As his thinking deepened, Daniel became increasingly aware of how emotional reactions shaped skeptical positions, noting how ridicule often replaced analysis when topics threatened identity or worldview, and The Proof is Out There stood out precisely because it refused ridicule, choosing instead to engage respectfully even with claims it ultimately questioned. This refusal had influenced Daniel more than he initially realized, because he now felt a growing responsibility to extend the same respect to uncertainty in his own reasoning, resisting the urge to perform confidence for social validation. One afternoon, while reviewing a segment where the show examined alleged footprint casts, Daniel noticed how the experts discussed measurement inconsistencies without contempt, treating each data point as potentially informative rather than embarrassing, and he recognized how rare this posture was in public discourse, where error is often weaponized rather than integrated. This approach resonated deeply with him, reinforcing the idea that inquiry is a process of refinement rather than a contest to be won. The Bigfoot files had become, in his mind, a case study in epistemic ethics, demonstrating how one might engage with controversial material without sacrificing rigor or compassion, and Daniel found this ethical dimension increasingly central to his interest. He began writing privately about this, not as a report but as a reflection, exploring how the treatment of Bigfoot mirrored broader patterns in how society handles unresolved questions, from scientific anomalies to social complexities, and he realized that the discomfort surrounding Bigfoot was symptomatic of a deeper unease with limits. The episode's repeated emphasis on patterns rather than proof resurfaced again, and Daniel found himself applying this framework to human behavior, noticing patterns of avoidance, defensiveness, and certainty that clustered around topics perceived as threatening. He thought about how the proof is out there framed Bigfoot sightings not as isolated events but as part of a distributed phenomenon, and he saw a parallel in how resistance to uncertainty manifested across disciplines, not isolated but systemic. This realization left him feeling both enlightened and isolated, because it placed him slightly out of sync with conversations that demanded quick conclusions. During a social gathering, Daniel found himself listening more than speaking, noticing how often people conflated skepticism with dismissal, and he felt a quiet frustration that mirrored the frustration he sensed beneath the surface of the show's expert commentary, a frustration born not of disagreement but of oversimplification. He recalled how the proof is out there had allowed competing interpretations to coexist within the same segment, trusting viewers to tolerate ambiguity, and he wished more discussions adopted this model, understanding now that ambiguity was not weakness but intellectual resilience. As weeks passed, Daniel's engagement with the Bigfoot files began to feel less like research and more like discipline, a daily practice of attentiveness to nuance, and he recognized that this discipline required effort, because certainty is easier, faster, and more socially rewarded. He revisited the episode's exploration of technological limits, particularly how camera traps and satellites fail in complex environments, and he extrapolated this to cognitive limits, recognizing that human perception is similarly constrained by expectation and bias, and this insight humbled him deeply. He began to see Bigfoot less as a subject and more as a catalyst, a persistent anomaly that exposed the fragility of human confidence in its own explanatory frameworks, and this exposure felt necessary rather than threatening. The proof is out there had not asked him to abandon skepticism, but it had asked him to refine it, stripping it of arrogance and grounding it in curiosity, and Daniel now understood that this refinement was an ongoing process rather than a destination. Late one night, as he reviewed his notes, he noticed how often the word humility appeared in his writing, and he smiled at the irony that a subject often mocked as fantastical had led him toward one of the most grounded intellectual virtues. He thought about how the episode ended without closure, and how that lack of resolution had once frustrated him but now felt appropriate, even generous, because it respected the viewer's capacity to live with questions. The Bigfoot files had taught him that mystery does not demand surrender, only patience, and that patience, when practiced consistently, reshapes perception itself. He felt a growing sense that whatever the truth about Bigfoot might be, its greatest impact was already evident in how it compelled those who engaged seriously with it to reconsider the posture of knowing, and this impact felt more enduring than any definitive proof could be. As Daniel closed his files and sat quietly, he recognized that the investigation had shifted from the external world to the internal one, from forests and footage to habits of thought, and he sensed that this shift marked a deeper stage of the journey, one that would test not his analytical skills but his capacity to remain open without becoming unmoored. The Bigfoot files, once a collection of data points, had become a mirror reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of human inquiry, and Daniel felt both challenged and strengthened by what he saw there, aware now that the true measure of understanding lay not in answers claimed but in questions sustained. Daniel Cross began to sense that the seventh stage of his engagement marked a subtle inversion, because instead of asking what Bigfoot might reveal about the world, he found himself increasingly asking what the world revealed about humanity through its reaction to Bigfoot, and this shift felt inevitable after months of sustained attention shaped by the proof is out there. The episode no longer replayed in his mind as a sequence of clips or expert analyses but as a structure, a method of inquiry that quietly resisted the binary of belief and disbelief, and Daniel realized that this resistance was precisely what made the phenomenon endure. He noticed how often discussions about Bigfoot collapsed into identity signaling, how belief became a badge of credulity and skepticism a badge of intelligence, and he contrasted this with the show's disciplined refusal to turn the subject into a proxy battle for worldview validation. The Proof Is Out There had modeled a third posture, one that accepted uncertainty as an honest outcome rather than a failure, and Daniel now saw how rare and fragile that posture was in public discourse. He began reviewing critical responses to the series, noting how some commentators accused it of being too cautious, too unwilling to take a stand, and he found these critiques revealing, because they exposed a cultural impatience with nuance, a desire for narratives that resolve rather than complicate. This impatience fascinated Daniel more than the creature itself, because it suggested that Bigfoot persisted not only in forests but in the unresolved spaces of collective psychology, where ambiguity was experienced as threat rather than opportunity. He returned again to the episode's treatment of eyewitness credibility, focusing on how the experts evaluated testimony based on internal consistency and contextual plausibility rather than emotional intensity, and Daniel recognized how this method challenged the common assumption that sincerity equates to truth or deception equates to malice. The show treated error as human rather than fraudulent, and this generosity of interpretation resonated deeply with him, because it acknowledged the limits of perception without dismissing experience outright. Daniel found himself applying this lens to broader social phenomena, noticing how quickly complex human experiences were labeled false simply because they resisted easy verification, and he realized that the Bigfoot files had quietly trained him to hold experience and evidence in productive tension rather than forcing one to dominate the other. As his thinking evolved, Daniel began to notice a creeping unease, not fear of the unknown but discomfort with how comfortable society had become in declaring the unknown irrelevant, and he traced this discomfort back to the show's repeated insistence that unresolved data deserved continued attention rather than ridicule. He recalled a segment where an expert explained how scientific consensus is provisional, subject to revision as new data emerges, and Daniel reflected on how rarely this provisional nature was acknowledged outside academic circles, where certainty was often performed for authority rather than accuracy. The Proof Is Out There had refused to perform certainty, and in doing so, it had exposed the performative aspects of much skepticism, a realization that unsettled Daniel because it implicated him as well. He began revisiting his earliest dismissals of Bigfoot, recognizing that they had been shaped less by evidence than by social norms about what serious people were allowed to consider, and this recognition forced him to confront the subtle ways conformity masqueraded as rationality. The episode's careful dismantling of hoaxes returned to his thoughts, particularly how the show emphasized motive and method rather than mockery, and Daniel appreciated how this approach preserved the integrity of inquiry while still acknowledging deception where it existed. He began to see that the true danger to understanding was not false belief but rigid certainty, whether skeptical or credulous, and this insight felt both liberating and isolating, because it placed him in a space that lacked clear social allies. During a quiet evening walk, Daniel noticed how the city lights erased the stars, and he thought about how visibility often came at the cost of depth, a metaphor that felt uncomfortably apt for modern knowledge production, and he contrasted this with the show's willingness to dwell in darkness metaphorically, allowing questions to remain unresolved. The Bigfoot files had become, for him, a meditation on attention, on what humans choose to see and what they choose to ignore, and he recognized that Bigfoot's power as a concept lay precisely in its refusal to be neatly categorized or dismissed. He thought again about the idea of an intelligent being that actively avoided detection, and while he remained agnostic about its literal existence, he found the metaphor compelling, because it mirrored how certain truths evade recognition not because they are false but because they do not align with dominant frameworks. The episode's emphasis on distributed evidence resurfaced, and Daniel saw parallels in how social truths often appear fragmented, emerging through patterns rather than singular events, and he wondered whether humanity's obsession with definitive proof blinded it to realities that required cumulative understanding. He revisited the show's discussion of technology, particularly the assumption that advanced tools guarantee knowledge, and he recognized how this assumption mirrored a broader faith in progress that equated innovation with insight, ignoring how tools are shaped by the questions they are designed to answer. The proof is out there had repeatedly shown that tools fail when questions are poorly framed, and Daniel now saw Bigfoot as a poorly framed question masquerading as an object of belief, its persistence a symptom of deeper epistemic misalignment. As his reflections deepened, Daniel began to feel a strange sense of gratitude toward the phenomenon itself, not for what it might prove but for what it revealed about the fragility and resilience of human inquiry. He noticed how often the episode returned to the phrase, "we don't know," and how rarely that phrase was allowed to stand alone in other contexts, usually followed by speculation or dismissal, and he admired the show's courage in letting it remain unadorned. This courage inspired him to practice a similar restraint in his own thinking, resisting the urge to fill gaps with assumptions, and he recognized how challenging this restraint was, requiring constant vigilance against the comfort of premature closure. He began to see Bigfoot not as an answer waiting to be discovered but as a question that refused to go away, and he understood that such questions played a vital role in intellectual ecosystems, preventing stagnation by continually testing the boundaries of certainty. The proof is out there had positioned itself as a steward of such questions, neither exploiting nor resolving them, and Daniel felt a growing respect for this stewardship, recognizing it as an ethical commitment rather than a narrative strategy. He thought about how the episode balanced skepticism with openness, and he realized that this balance was not static but dynamic, requiring ongoing adjustment as new information emerged, and this dynamic quality appealed to him deeply, because it mirrored the complexity of the natural world itself. As he sat late one night reviewing his notes, Daniel noticed that his language had changed, becoming less declarative and more exploratory, and he traced this change directly to the influence of the Bigfoot files, which had taught him that intellectual strength lay not in certainty but in sustained engagement. He felt a quiet sense of alignment, as if his thinking had slowed to match the pace of the questions he was considering, and this slowing felt restorative rather than limiting. The Bigfoot files had not brought him closer to resolving the mystery, but they had brought him closer to a mode of attention capable of honoring complexity without surrendering rigor. As Daniel closed his files, he recognized that the seventh stage of his journey was marked not by new evidence but by a deepened capacity to live with uncertainty, and he sensed that this capacity would be tested further as the inquiry continued, because the most challenging mysteries were not those that resisted explanation but those that exposed the limits of explanation itself. In that realization, Daniel felt both humbled and strengthened, aware that whatever lay ahead, the true measure of progress would not be the disappearance of the question but the quality of attention he brought to it. By the eighth phase of Daniel Cross's journey, the inquiry had acquired a quiet gravity that no longer depended on novelty or discovery, because what the proof is out there had initiated was now sustained by habit, a disciplined return to uncertainty that had begun to shape Daniel's inner life as much as his intellectual one, and he sensed that something irreversible had taken place. A recalibration of how he oriented himself toward knowledge, absence, and patience. The episode that had started it all no longer felt like a piece of media but like a fixed reference point, a compass he returned to not for answers but for alignment, and this alignment became increasingly important as he noticed how the world around him seemed to accelerate, demanding faster judgments, louder opinions, and sharper conclusions. Against this backdrop, the Bigfoot files stood as a countercurrent, reminding him that some questions resist velocity, that understanding unfolds at a pace determined not by urgency but by complexity. Daniel found himself revisiting the show's emphasis on longitudinal thinking, the idea that certain phenomena can only be approached meaningfully over extended periods of observation, and he realized how deeply this ran against contemporary expectations of immediacy. Bigfoot, in this sense, functioned as a long-duration problem, one that exposed the impatience embedded in modern epistemology, and Daniel began to see this impatience not as a flaw of individuals but as a structural feature of the systems that rewarded decisiveness over deliberation. He rewatched segments of the episode where experts spoke about multi-generational wildlife studies, noting how decades of data were often required to confirm the existence or behavior of elusive species, and he contrasted this with the dismissive tone often applied to Bigfoot claims, dismissals made without anything resembling comparable temporal investment. This contrast unsettled him, because it suggested that the refusal to engage seriously with the phenomenon was less about evidence and more about unwillingness to commit time and attention to something that offered no guarantee of resolution. The Proof Is Out There had implicitly challenged this unwillingness by treating Bigfoot as worthy of sustained inquiry regardless of outcome, and Daniel now recognized this as a radical proposition in a culture that equated worth with payoff. As he reflected on this, Daniel noticed a shift in how he experienced waiting, moments once filled with restlessness now becoming opportunities for observation, and he traced this change directly to the show's pacing, its refusal to rush viewers toward conclusions. The Bigfoot files had taught him that waiting was not a passive state but an active engagement with the possibility that something meaningful might emerge slowly, and this lesson began to permeate other areas of his life, from professional projects to personal relationships. He realized that the discomfort many felt around unresolved mysteries stemmed not from fear of the unknown but from fear of prolonged uncertainty, a fear that demanded closure as a form of relief, and Bigfoot's enduring presence denied that relief, forcing a confrontation with patience itself. The episode's repeated acknowledgement of gaps in data resurfaced in his mind, particularly the way the experts spoke openly about what could not be known with current methods, and Daniel admired this transparency, recognizing how rare it was to hear authority figures articulate limits without defensiveness. This articulation of limits felt like an invitation rather than a retreat, and Daniel began to understand that intellectual honesty often required the courage to say less rather than more. He began applying this principle to his own analyses, noticing how often he had previously filled gaps with speculation simply to maintain narrative coherence, and he now resisted that impulse, allowing incompleteness to stand unadorned. The Bigfoot files had normalized this incompleteness, presenting it not as failure but as an accurate reflection of reality, and Daniel found this normalization quietly transformative. He thought again about the episode's discussion of environmental acoustics, how sound behaves differently in dense forests, bending, dispersing, and deceiving the ear, and he extended this metaphor to information itself, recognizing how context shapes perception in ways that are often invisible to the observer. Just as sound can appear to come from nowhere, so too can patterns emerge without clear origin, and Daniel saw in this a powerful explanation for why Bigfoot evidence felt perpetually elusive, not because it was false but because it existed within systems poorly suited to human modes of detection. This insight deepened his appreciation for the show's multidisciplinary approach, which drew on biology, physics, psychology, and history without privileging one perspective as definitive, and he recognized that this pluralism was essential to engaging with complex phenomena. The Proof Is Out There had refused reductionism, and Daniel now understood reductionism as a comfort strategy rather than a truth strategy, a way of simplifying the world to manageable proportions at the cost of fidelity. As his thinking matured, Daniel began to feel less invested in the outcome of the Bigfoot question and more invested in the integrity of the process by which it was approached, and this shift brought with it an unexpected sense of calm. He no longer felt compelled to defend a position or anticipate rebuttal, because his engagement was no longer adversarial, and this non-adversarial stance felt like a quiet rebellion against the performative certainty that dominated discourse. He revisited the episode's exploration of camera bias, how devices capture only what they are positioned to capture, and he reflected on how human inquiry operated under similar constraints, shaped by funding priorities, cultural narratives, and technological affordances. The Bigfoot files had exposed these constraints without cynicism, simply by demonstrating their effects, and Daniel now saw that acknowledging constraint was the first step toward expanding awareness. He began to wonder how many other phenomena occupied similar blind spots, not because they were extraordinary but because they were inconvenient, demanding resources and attention without promising definitive payoff. This wondering extended beyond Bigfoot into broader questions about what kinds of knowledge society chose to pursue, and Daniel felt a growing conviction that unresolved questions played a crucial role in maintaining epistemic humility. The episode's tone, calm and measured, continued to resonate with him, especially in contrast to sensational media that thrived on emotional extremes, and he recognized that the show's restraint was not a lack of passion but a different expression of it, a passion for accuracy over excitement. He thought about how Bigfoot, stripped of spectacle, became less frightening and more instructive, a case study in how complexity resists capture, and he found this reframing deeply satisfying. During a late evening, Daniel reread his accumulated notes, now sprawling and nonlinear, and he noticed how few of them focused on proving or disproving existence, and how many focused on methodology, perception, and patience, and he realized that the inquiry had effectively inverted itself. The Bigfoot files were no longer about a creature at the edge of the forest but about the edges of knowing, the places where certainty frayed and attention mattered most. He recognized that this inversion was not accidental but cultivated by The Proof Is Out There, which had consistently framed the mystery as an invitation to think better rather than believe harder. This realization brought with it a sense of responsibility, because engaging with the unknown ethically required discipline, humility, and restraint, qualities that had to be practiced rather than assumed. Daniel began to see the Bigfoot phenomenon as a kind of training ground, a space where these qualities could be exercised without immediate consequence, preparing the mind for more consequential uncertainties elsewhere. He appreciated how the episode never asked viewers to suspend disbelief, only to suspend dismissal, and he recognized how profound this distinction was, because dismissal closed inquiry while disbelief kept it alive. As the weeks went on, Daniel felt increasingly at ease with not knowing, and this ease surprised him, because it felt more stable than the brittle confidence he had once prized. He noticed that conversations that once would have provoked irritation now elicited curiosity, and he traced this change back to the show's modeling of respectful engagement, which treated disagreement as an opportunity for refinement rather than a threat. The Bigfoot files had reshaped not only what he thought about but how he thought, and this metacognitive shift felt like the true substance of the journey. Late one night, Sitting alone, Daniel reflected on the possibility that Bigfoot might never be conclusively proven or disproven, and he felt an unexpected sense of acceptance, because he now understood that the value of the inquiry lay not in its resolution but in its capacity to cultivate patience, humility, and attentiveness. The proof is out there had not promised answers, and Daniel no longer expected them, because what he had gained was something quieter and more durable, a way of engaging with the unknown that did not require conquest or surrender. The Bigfoot files, in this 8th phase, had become a testament to the power of sustained attention, a reminder that some truths reveal themselves not through force or speed but through the willingness to remain present in uncertainty long enough for understanding, however partial, to take shape. By the 9th stage of Daniel Cross's engagement, something subtle but decisive had occurred, because the question of Bigfoot had ceased to feel external altogether and had instead folded itself into his understanding of how meaning persists even when resolution does not, and this folding marked a deeper integration of what the proof is out there had quietly cultivated from the beginning. He realized that he no longer approached the episode, or the broader phenomenon it represented, with the posture of an investigator standing apart, but with the posture of a participant embedded within a longer, slower process of knowing, one that extended beyond any single conclusion. This realization emerged not in a moment of insight but gradually, through repetition, as he noticed how often his thoughts returned to the show's calm insistence that uncertainty, when held with care, could become a form of clarity rather than confusion. The Bigfoot files had begun to function as a kind of internal archive, a reference not to facts alone but to a way of attending to the world, and Daniel sensed that this archive would continue shaping his thinking long after the question itself faded from prominence. He revisited the episode yet again, this time struck by how little it demanded from the viewer emotionally, offering neither fear nor wonder as an obligation, and he recognized that this emotional neutrality was not indifference but respect, allowing viewers to bring their own responses without manipulation. This restraint stood in stark contrast to narratives that relied on escalation to maintain engagement, and Daniel appreciated how the proof is out there trusted that careful observation could sustain attention without spectacle. He began to see Bigfoot less as a subject of fascination and more as a test of endurance, a phenomenon that revealed who was willing to remain engaged without reward, without resolution, and without social reinforcement. This endurance, he realized, was rare, because it required resisting both belief and dismissal, occupying a space that offered neither comfort nor closure. The episode's repeated return to unresolved footage now felt like an invitation to practice this endurance, and Daniel accepted it not as a challenge to be overcome but as a condition to be inhabited. As he reflected on this, he noticed how often human systems prioritize answers over questions, products over processes, and he began to understand Bigfoot's persistence as a kind of friction against this prioritization, a reminder that not all phenomena yield to extraction or efficiency. The proof is out there had framed this friction gently, without accusation, yet its implications were profound, suggesting that the value of inquiry might lie not in what it produces but in how it disciplines attention over time. Daniel found himself increasingly aware of how attention itself was shaped by incentives, how curiosity narrowed when outcomes were predefined, and he recognized that Bigfoot occupied a rare space where curiosity could remain open-ended, unmoored from utility. This recognition altered his sense of what constituted meaningful inquiry, shifting it away from problem-solving toward presence, and this shift felt both disorienting and liberating. He thought about the episode's treatment of environmental context, how it emphasized not isolated events but ecosystems of interaction, and he extended this framework inward, recognizing that his own thinking existed within an ecosystem of assumptions, habits, and expectations that the Bigfoot files had gradually reshaped. He began to notice how often he paused before forming opinions, allowing uncertainty to settle rather than rushing to fill it, and he understood that this pause was not hesitation but a cultivated skill, one he traced directly to the show's pacing and tone. The Proof Is Out There had taught him that silence was not empty but generative, a space where perception could recalibrate, and Daniel now practiced this silence deliberately, both in thought and conversation. He recalled a segment where experts discussed the difficulty of falsifying claims that were distributed rather than centralized, and he recognized how this difficulty mirrored challenges in other domains, from climate systems to social dynamics, where causality was diffuse and outcomes emergent. Bigfoot, in this light, became less an anomaly and more a representative of complex systems that resist linear explanation, and Daniel appreciated how the episode had introduced this complexity without jargon, trusting viewers to intuit its significance. This trust had deepened his engagement, because it treated him not as a consumer of answers but as a collaborator in inquiry, and he felt a sense of responsibility emerge from that treatment. He began to wonder how many other unresolved questions might benefit from similar framing, and he felt a growing frustration with narratives that reduced complexity to certainty for the sake of clarity. The Bigfoot files had shown him that clarity and certainty were not synonymous, and that clarity could emerge from acknowledging limits rather than denying them. As weeks passed, Daniel noticed that his relationship with evidence itself had evolved, becoming less transactional and more contextual, as he paid greater attention to how data was gathered, framed, and interpreted, rather than treating it as an objective arbiter detached from human practice. The Proof Is Out There had consistently highlighted methodology alongside findings, and Daniel now saw this emphasis as a corrective to a culture that fetishized results while neglecting process. He returned to the episode's discussion of thermal imaging, recalling how experts emphasized interpretation over raw imagery, and he saw a parallel in how meaning itself required interpretation, shaped by perspective and expectation. This insight deepened his humility, because it underscored how easily certainty could be mistaken for understanding when interpretation went unexamined. He found himself increasingly resistant to definitive claims in any domain, not out of cynicism but out of respect for complexity, and he recognized that this resistance was a direct outcome of his sustained engagement with the Bigfoot files. He began to think of Bigfoot as a kind of cognitive landmark, a reminder of where certainty faltered and inquiry began, and this framing allowed him to appreciate the phenomenon without needing to resolve it. The episode's calm closing statements echoed in his mind, particularly the acknowledgement that some questions remain open not because of failure but because openness is the most accurate representation of current knowledge, and Daniel found this acknowledgement increasingly comforting. He realized that the discomfort he once felt in the absence of answers had been replaced by a steadier sense of orientation, one grounded not in conclusions but in attentiveness. He noticed how this orientation influenced his interactions with others, making him less reactive, more willing to listen, and more comfortable admitting uncertainty, and he recognized that these changes were not incidental but integral to the discipline the show had modeled. The Bigfoot files had reshaped his relationship with not knowing, transforming it from a deficiency into a space of engagement, and Daniel felt a quiet gratitude for this transformation. He thought again about the possibility that Bigfoot might be conclusively disproven one day, and he realized that such a resolution would not undo the value of the inquiry, because the habits of thought it had cultivated would remain applicable elsewhere. Conversely, if Bigfoot were conclusively proven, he suspected that the revelation would matter less than the process by which it was accepted, and whether humanity would approach it with humility or triumphalism. The Proof Is Out There had implicitly advocated for the former, and Daniel hoped that this ethic would prevail, recognizing how easily discovery could become domination if not tempered by restraint. As he reviewed his notes once more, he saw that the Bigfoot files had become less about documentation and more about orientation, a way of situating himself in relation to the unknown without demanding control. This orientation felt stable, resilient, and adaptable, qualities he now valued more than certainty. Late one evening, Daniel reflected on how far he had come from his initial viewing of the episode, when curiosity had been tinged with irritation, and he felt a quiet sense of continuity, understanding that the journey had not replaced skepticism but had refined it. The Bigfoot files, in this ninth phase, had become a testament to the enduring value of questions that refuse to disappear, not because they mock understanding but because they invite it to grow beyond the need for finality. Daniel sensed that whatever remained ahead would deepen this invitation further, challenging him to sustain attention without expectation, and he felt ready for that challenge, not because he anticipated answers, but because he had learned that engagement itself could be sufficient. By the time Daniel Cross reached what he privately thought of as the 10th movement of his immersion, the shape of his engagement with the proof is out there had shifted again, becoming quieter, slower, and more inward, as though the external material of the Bigfoot files now served primarily as a catalyst for a more sustained interior dialogue. He no longer watched the episodes with the expectation of learning something new in a factual sense, because the core evidentiary landscape had already revealed its contours, but instead with the expectation of noticing how his own perception responded to repetition, nuance, and subtle variation. This expectation transformed each viewing into a kind of observational practice, one in which the subject under scrutiny was not Bigfoot itself but the mechanisms of attention, belief, and doubt that arose in response to it. He began to recognize that the show's power did not lie in its individual claims but in its cumulative effect, the way its steady rhythm trained the mind to remain present without being pulled toward resolution. In this sense, the Bigfoot files had become less like a documentary and more like a discipline, an exercise in maintaining openness over time, and Daniel found that this discipline was increasingly difficult to abandon once adopted. He noticed how often his thoughts returned to the episode during moments of unrelated uncertainty, when outcomes were unclear or information incomplete, and he realized that the show had provided him with a model for inhabiting those moments without anxiety. The calm tone of the investigators, their careful language, and their refusal to exaggerate now felt like a moral stance rather than a stylistic choice, suggesting an ethic of inquiry grounded in restraint. Daniel reflected on how rare this ethic had become in a culture saturated with immediacy and amplification, where attention was treated as a commodity and uncertainty as a flaw to be eliminated. The proof is out there had resisted this culture not by opposing it directly but by declining to participate in its urgency, and Daniel appreciated how this refusal created a different temporal space for engagement. In this space, Bigfoot was not a spectacle demanding reaction but a phenomenon inviting patience, and patience, Daniel realized, was itself a form of resistance. He thought about the many eyewitness accounts discussed in the episode, recalling how they were neither endorsed nor dismissed outright, and he saw in this approach a respect for human experience that did not confuse empathy with validation. This distinction mattered to him deeply, because it acknowledged the sincerity of perception without surrendering the rigor of analysis, and Daniel recognized how often public discourse collapsed these categories, forcing a false choice between belief and contempt. The Bigfoot files had navigated this tension with surprising grace, and Daniel found himself applying this same grace in other contexts, listening more carefully to accounts he did not fully accept, allowing space for meaning without prematurely assigning truth value. As he revisited the segment on environmental acoustics, he was struck by how much of the discussion centered on misinterpretation rather than deception, emphasizing how unfamiliar sounds could be shaped by expectation, fear, and context. This emphasis resonated with him, because it reframed error not as failure but as an inevitable feature of perception, one that demanded humility rather than judgment. He extended this insight to his own thinking, recognizing how often his interpretations were shaped by prior assumptions, and he began to see Bigfoot as a mirror reflecting the limits of perception rather than a test of credibility. The Proof Is Out There had quietly suggested that understanding these limits was more valuable than transcending them, and Daniel found this suggestion increasingly persuasive. He became aware that his earlier desire for resolution had been tied to a deeper discomfort with ambiguity, and that this discomfort had diminished as he practiced staying with uncertainty rather than escaping it. The Bigfoot files had provided a structured environment in which to practice this staying, and Daniel now recognized the show as a training ground for a broader intellectual maturity. He thought about how the investigators consistently returned to primary data, footage, audio, and environmental context, refusing to build narratives beyond what the material could support, and he saw in this refusal a respect for reality that did not depend on mastery. Reality, in this framing, was not something to be conquered by explanation but something to be approached with care, and Bigfoot functioned as a boundary marker indicating where explanation must slow down. Daniel noticed how this slowing down affected his sense of time, making him less impatient with processes that unfolded gradually, and he traced this change back to the show's deliberate pacing. The Proof Is Out There had taught him that speed was not synonymous with intelligence, and that quick conclusions often concealed shallow engagement. As he reflected on this lesson, he felt a subtle shift in his priorities, valuing depth over breadth, and presence over productivity. He recalled a discussion in the episode about the challenges of studying phenomena that resist replication, and he saw how Bigfoot exemplified this resistance, existing at the margins of scientific methodology without being entirely outside it. This liminal status fascinated him, because it exposed the assumptions underlying empirical practice, assumptions about repeatability, control, and predictability that did not always hold in complex, natural systems. The Bigfoot files had not framed this exposure as a critique of science but as an invitation to expand its scope, and Daniel appreciated the generosity of this invitation. He found himself thinking about other phenomena that occupied similar margins, from rare ecological events to emergent social behaviors, and he recognized that Bigfoot's cultural persistence might be less about the creature itself and more about what it revealed regarding how humans relate to the unknown. The Proof Is Out There had positioned Bigfoot as a case study in epistemic humility, and Daniel felt that this humility was increasingly necessary in a world characterized by complexity and interdependence. He noticed how often public discourse treated uncertainty as weakness, and he contrasted this with the show's portrayal of uncertainty as honesty, a faithful representation of what was not yet known. This portrayal resonated with him, because it aligned with his growing sense that integrity in inquiry required acknowledging limits rather than disguising them. He began to think of the Bigfoot files as a form of quiet pedagogy, teaching not through instruction but through example, modeling how to engage with unresolved questions without defensiveness or spectacle. This modeling had influenced his own behavior, making him more attentive to how he framed questions, how he listened to responses, and how he responded to disagreement. He realized that his conversations had become less about persuasion and more about exploration, and he credited the show with fostering this shift. As he revisited the episode's closing remarks, he was struck by their restraint, how they resisted summarizing or concluding, instead leaving the viewer with an open horizon of possibility. This openness no longer frustrated him, because he had learned to see it as an accurate reflection of the phenomenon itself, and of reality more broadly. Bigfoot, in this light, was not a puzzle to be solved but a presence that structured inquiry, shaping how questions were asked rather than dictating answers. The Proof Is Out There had embraced this structuring role, and Daniel felt grateful for having encountered a narrative that valued process over payoff. He sensed that his engagement was approaching another transition, one that would require integrating these lessons more fully into his life beyond the show, and he felt both anticipation and calm at the prospect. The Bigfoot files had already altered his relationship with uncertainty, evidence, and attention, and he suspected that whatever came next would deepen this alteration further, challenging him to sustain these practices without the external scaffold of the series. As he sat with this thought, he felt a quiet confidence that the discipline he had cultivated would endure, because it was no longer tied to Bigfoot alone but to a way of being with the unknown that felt both honest and humane. What Daniel Cross experienced in what he came to regard as the 11th phase of his engagement was not an escalation but a consolidation, a quiet gathering together of all the shifts that had already occurred, forming something more stable and less dramatic but also more enduring, as if the question of Bigfoot had finally settled into its proper place within his internal landscape. By now, The Proof Is Out There no longer felt like a program he watched but like a reference point he returned to mentally, a steady axis around which other questions rotated, and this change was subtle enough that he only recognized it in hindsight. He noticed that when confronted with ambiguity in his professional life, incomplete information, contradictory reports, or unresolved tensions, his response had changed, slowing almost automatically, adopting the same measured cadence he associated with the investigators on the show. This cadence was not performative, it emerged naturally, shaped by long exposure to a mode of inquiry that prioritized careful framing over dramatic payoff. Bigfoot, once an object of mild curiosity, had become an organizing symbol, a reminder that some questions resist closure not because they are flawed but because they exceed the structures imposed upon them. Daniel realized that his earlier fascination had been fueled by a desire to see the unknown tamed, rendered legible within familiar categories, but that this desire had quietly loosened its grip. The Bigfoot files had taught him to recognize the violence implicit in premature certainty, the way it flattened complexity and foreclosed further inquiry, and this recognition now guided his thinking more broadly. He returned again to the episode, not out of habit but out of a sense of alignment, noticing how its tone continued to resonate with his own internal state, neither urgent nor complacent, but attentively neutral. The investigators' language still stood out to him, especially their careful avoidance of absolutes, their preference for conditional phrasing, and he saw in this not evasiveness but intellectual honesty, a refusal to claim more than the evidence allowed. This refusal, Daniel understood, was increasingly rare in a culture that rewarded confidence regardless of foundation, and he felt a growing respect for the discipline required to maintain it. As he watched, he became more aware of how the show framed human error, not as a moral failing but as an expected feature of perception, and he appreciated how this framing preserved dignity without sacrificing rigor. Eyewitnesses were treated as sincere but fallible, data as informative but incomplete, and this balanced approach felt increasingly humane to him, especially in contrast to narratives that polarized belief and skepticism into opposing camps. The Bigfoot files had quietly dissolved this opposition, demonstrating that skepticism need not be dismissive and that openness need not be credulous, and Daniel found that this dissolution mirrored changes in his own thinking. He noticed how he now held conflicting possibilities in parallel without feeling compelled to collapse them into a single conclusion, and he recognized this capacity as a form of cognitive maturity he had not previously cultivated. Bigfoot, in this sense, functioned less as a subject and more as a training ground, a sustained exercise in tolerating unresolved tension without anxiety. The Proof Is Out There had provided the structure for this exercise, returning repeatedly to the same footage, the same claims, the same environments, not to exhaust them but to reveal how interpretation shifted over time. Daniel found this temporal dimension increasingly significant, realizing that meaning often emerged not from new information but from revisiting old information with altered perspective. He began to see how his own shifts in interpretation said as much about his internal state as about the material itself, and this reflexivity deepened his engagement. The episode's emphasis on environmental context continued to resonate, especially the way it situated alleged encounters within vast, sparsely understood landscapes, reminding viewers of how limited human perception remained in the face of complex ecosystems. Daniel extended this reminder inward, recognizing that his own cognitive landscape was similarly vast and only partially mapped, shaped by habits, assumptions, and cultural narratives he rarely examined explicitly. Bigfoot, by resisting clear placement within these narratives, had exposed their contours, making visible the frameworks through which he interpreted uncertainty. This exposure was not destabilizing but clarifying, because it allowed him to see where his thinking ended and where speculation began, and to respect that boundary without discomfort. He thought again about the show's treatment of technology, how tools like thermal imaging and audio analysis were presented as aids rather than arbiters, and he appreciated this humility, recognizing how easily technology could be imbued with authority it did not deserve. The Proof Is Out There consistently emphasized interpretation over instrumentation, and Daniel now saw this emphasis as a safeguard against overconfidence, a reminder that tools extended perception but did not replace judgment. This insight had begun to influence how he evaluated information more generally, making him more attentive to how data was contextualized and less impressed by technical sophistication alone. He found himself increasingly resistant to arguments that relied on complexity to obscure uncertainty, and he credited the show with sharpening this discernment. As he reflected on the persistence of Bigfoot in popular culture, he began to see it less as a failure of science and more as a testament to the endurance of mystery in a world increasingly oriented toward control. The Bigfoot files had framed this endurance without ridicule or reverence, allowing it to stand as a fact in its own right, and Daniel appreciated this restraint. He realized that the show had never promised resolution, only examination, and that this promise had been kept with remarkable consistency. This consistency had fostered trust, not because it confirmed beliefs but because it respected limits, and Daniel understood that trust was rooted not in agreement but in integrity. He began to think of integrity as the central theme of the Bigfoot files, an integrity of method, tone, and intention that distinguished it from more sensational treatments. This integrity had quietly influenced his own standards, making him less tolerant of shortcuts in reasoning and more appreciative of careful articulation. He noticed how his conversations now included more qualifiers, more acknowledgments of uncertainty, and he recognized these not as weaknesses but as markers of honesty. The Proof Is Out There had modeled a way of speaking about the unknown that preserved curiosity without surrendering to fantasy, and Daniel felt grateful for having internalized this model. He thought about the possibility that his engagement with the show was nearing its natural conclusion, not because the question had been answered but because the lesson had been learned, and he felt a sense of quiet completeness at this thought. Bigfoot no longer demanded his attention as an unresolved problem, it had become a stable reference point, a reminder of how to engage with uncertainty responsibly. He realized that this transformation was perhaps the show's greatest achievement, not converting skeptics or believers, but cultivating a mode of inquiry capable of holding both positions lightly. As he revisited the episode one more time, he noticed that his emotional response was now almost entirely neutral, neither excited nor frustrated, but attentive and calm, and he recognized this neutrality as a sign of integration rather than disengagement. The Bigfoot Files had done its work not by delivering answers but by reshaping his relationship to questions, and Daniel felt confident that this reshaping would endure beyond the series itself. He sensed that one final phase remained, not to resolve the inquiry but to release it, allowing what had been learned to operate independently, and he approached this prospect with a steady sense of readiness, understanding that the value of the journey lay not in its endpoint but in the habits of mind it had left behind. In what Daniel Cross understood as the 12th and final movement of his engagement, there was no sense of climax, no dramatic resolution, and no revelation waiting to be unveiled, only a gradual loosening, as if the question that had once occupied so much conceptual space was now gently releasing its hold, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer needed to be. This phase felt different from all the others in its quietness, a quietness not born of fatigue but of completion, the kind that follows a long, attentive process when its purpose has been fulfilled even if its subject remains unresolved. Daniel noticed that he no longer felt compelled to revisit the Bigfoot Files out of curiosity or discipline, but out of a softer impulse, something closer to acknowledgement, as one might revisit a familiar landscape knowing that it will look the same and yet never be experienced in exactly the same way again. The proof is out there had by now fully dissolved into his cognitive background, shaping how he perceived uncertainty without requiring conscious reference, and this dissolution felt like the final sign that the inquiry had done its work. Bigfoot, once a catalyst for investigation, now existed as a symbolic presence rather than a problem, a marker of where knowledge blurred into interpretation and where patience replaced urgency. Daniel realized that he no longer framed the phenomenon in terms of belief or disbelief, because those categories now seemed insufficiently nuanced to capture what he had learned. Instead, Bigfoot represented a boundary condition, a reminder that not all questions are meant to be closed and that some derive their meaning precisely from remaining open. This realization did not arrive as an insight but as a settling, a subtle realignment of expectations that had been unfolding for some time and now reached equilibrium. He reflected on how the proof is out there had never attempted to resolve the mystery through authority or spectacle, but had consistently foregrounded process, context, and restraint, and he recognized that this consistency had been the foundation of its influence. The show had trusted viewers to remain engaged without manipulation, and Daniel felt that this trust had been repaid through sustained attention and genuine transformation. As he revisited the episode one final time, he noticed details that once seemed peripheral now felt central, particularly the way the investigators spoke about limits, about what could and could not be known with current tools and methods. These acknowledgments no longer felt like disclaimers but like expressions of respect for reality itself, an acceptance that knowledge advanced not by conquest but by careful negotiation with complexity. Daniel found that this acceptance resonated deeply with his own evolving worldview, one that increasingly valued humility over certainty and engagement over dominance. He thought about how often human narratives demanded resolution as proof of meaning, and how the Bigfoot Files had quietly subverted this demand by demonstrating that meaning could emerge through sustained inquiry alone. Bigfoot's persistence was no longer frustrating to him, because he now understood it as an invitation rather than an obstacle, an invitation to practice attentiveness without expectation. This practice had extended beyond the show, influencing how he approached relationships, work, and even his internal dialogue, making him less reactive and more observant. He noticed that moments of not knowing no longer triggered the same discomfort they once had, and he traced this shift back to the steady exposure to unresolved evidence, carefully framed and patiently examined. The proof is out there had normalized uncertainty without glamorizing it, presenting it as a natural condition rather than a failure, and this normalization had quietly recalibrated his tolerance for ambiguity. Daniel realized that what he had gained was not a position on Bigfoot but a capacity, the capacity to remain present with questions that lacked immediate answers, to resist the impulse to fill gaps prematurely, and to recognize when restraint was the most honest response. This capacity felt transferable, applicable far beyond the confines of cryptozoology, and he sensed that it would continue to shape his thinking long after the specifics of the episode faded from memory. He reflected on how the show had balanced skepticism and openness without collapsing into either, and he saw in this balance a model for responsible inquiry in an era marked by polarization and overconfidence. The Bigfoot files had demonstrated that it was possible to examine extraordinary claims without either endorsing them uncritically or dismissing them reflexively, and Daniel felt that this demonstration carried ethical weight. He began to think of the series as less a documentary and more a quiet intervention into how knowledge was discussed and valued, offering an alternative to the extremes that dominated public discourse. This alternative emphasized patience, care, and proportionality, qualities that now felt increasingly urgent in a world driven by acceleration and amplification. As he sat with these thoughts, Daniel recognized that the question of Bigfoot had never truly been the point, that it had functioned instead as a stable focal object around which deeper habits of thought could form. The creature's ambiguity had provided just enough resistance to prevent closure, ensuring that the inquiry remained active without becoming obsessive. The proof is out there had curated this resistance carefully, neither resolving it nor exploiting it, and Daniel appreciated the discipline required to maintain such balance. He realized that the show's greatest achievement lay not in what it proved or disproved, but in what it modeled, a way of engaging with the unknown that preserved dignity, curiosity, and intellectual honesty. This modeling had quietly reshaped his internal standards, making him more attentive to how questions were framed, how evidence was weighed, and how conclusions were expressed. He noticed that he now instinctively questioned not just claims but the tone in which they were delivered, recognizing how tone shaped perception as much as content. The calm, measured voice of the proof is out there had become a reference point, a reminder that seriousness did not require urgency and that depth did not require drama. As he prepared to move on from the series, Daniel felt no sense of loss, only a quiet gratitude for the way it had accompanied him through a gradual reorientation of thought. Bigfoot no longer loomed as an unresolved mystery demanding attention, it rested instead as a symbol of epistemic humility, a reminder that some aspects of reality resisted capture and that this resistance was not a flaw to be corrected but a feature to be respected. He understood now that the value of the Bigfoot files lay not in the accumulation of evidence but in the cultivation of attentiveness, and that this cultivation was complete insofar as it no longer depended on the show itself. The inquiry had been internalized, its lessons absorbed into his way of being, and this internalization marked the true conclusion of the journey. As he closed his notebook and turned off the screen, Daniel felt a steady sense of orientation rather than closure, an understanding that questions would continue to arise, unresolved and complex, and that he was now better equipped to meet them without anxiety or impatience. The proof is out there had not given him answers, but it had given him something more enduring, a disciplined openness, a respect for limits, and a trust in the value of inquiry itself. In this final phase, Daniel released the question of Bigfoot not by abandoning it, but by allowing it to remain what it had always been, an invitation to attend carefully to the unknown, and in doing so, he recognized that the journey had reached its natural end, not with certainty, but with quiet confidence in the process that would carry forward into whatever questions came next.